going to start this show with a question. What's the most critical factor when it comes to surviving in a hostile environment? Have a think about it while I have a look around this hut to see if I could survive here for any length of time. Well, cabins like this for anyone stuck in the bush are a godsend. For a start, there's a roof over my head. I'm at a place called Rose Inlet in southeast Alaska, and they get over 12 feet of rain here a year, so shelter is important. You can also tell that they get a lot of snow here because there's one really big stove there, bang in the middle of the cabin. There's firewood and even some matches beside it. There are fish hooks here, so food shouldn't be a problem because the cove is absolutely packed with fish. There's also a freshwater creek at the head of the cove, so I won't have any problem for drinking water either. So on the face of it, I'm pretty well set up. And when Elmo Wortman and his son Randy found this hut after being shipwrecked 2 weeks earlier, he knew that the two of them stood a very good chance of surviving. But they left Randy's two sisters 6 miles away with virtually no food, water, shelter or warmth in the middle of winter. What kept them alive is the subject of this programme.
It doesn't matter how well the rest of your body is functioning. Essentially, if we're talking survival, it is your mind that keeps you alive.
Survival is psychology, because your head is what makes the decisions about how you perceive the threat that you're faced with and whether you're going to approach it with a realistic optimism or whether you'll feel overwhelmed and quit and perish.
This programme is about the psychology of survival. Everyone we hear from has been through some sort of disaster and survived, or spent their life's work trying to figure out why they came through while others around them died.
Everyone is a potential victim. Not everyone is a potential survivor. What we're trying to do is to find out why people die when they don't need to die.
There are plenty of examples of individuals who have been thrust into a survival situation, who have had ample food, water, shelter, but because of the magnitude of the whole have become discouraged. That discouragement has lent itself to a feeling of loss of control and helplessness, and people have perished in situations like that.
One classic example is the story of the West One, a fishing boat which sank in a totally different environment to this one, in the Pacific Ocean off Hawaii. The crew took to 2 life rafts connected by a length of rope. The ship's captain was in one and the first mate in the other. They were at sea for 2 weeks before they were rescued by another ship.
During that time, 2 separate cultures, if you like, developed in those life rafts. In one life raft under the command of the mate clearly took control of the situation.
Everyone all right? Yeah.
So they went through basic drills. They mopped out the life raft, they got the water out to prevent saltwater sores occurring. Food and rations were all spread out equally and so on. The other life raft, none of this took place. The men did not adapt to that environment and did not help themselves.
When they were rescued, the survivors in the mate's raft were able to board the rescue ship without any difficulty. But those who'd been in the captain's life raft were too weak to get onto the ship by themselves. As for the captain, he died the day before the rescue. If the ordeal had lasted for much longer, it's quite possible that lack of clear discipline on his raft could have led to the deaths of all the others on it. And remember, both groups started out with exactly the same provisions and rafts.
It's a classic example. In one life raft, we're seeing a psychological disintegration occurring, and in the life raft under the command of the mate, we're seeing people take back control over the situation, control over the environment, control over the events, and certainly control over themselves.
We regularly see pictures of disaster victims on TV, but pictures like this are much rarer. People fleeing seconds before a tornado strikes. In this critical stage, whether you panic or stay in control of your actions dramatically affects your chances of survival. How do researchers know this? Well, they talked to hundreds of people who survived incidents like this. The 1996 crash of an Ethiopian plane that ran out of fuel during a hijacking.
When I first realized we were being hijacked, the first thought I had was, well, uh-oh, this is going to be a long day. You know, the inconvenience factor more than fear almost.
The mind wants to say, no, this is not true, we're not ready for this, we'd much prefer this all to go away, and the mind does that to you.
There were a couple of guys sitting here, and I tried to sort of get their attention because they were on the outside in the window. I wanted to see if they could tell me where we were flying to, and these guys were totally uninterested in having any dealings. It was almost like they were reading the newspaper, you know.
The problem with denial is that it prevents us from taking the basic actions that are required to survive, like double-checking where the escape exits are, double-checking whether you're over land or over water. Do you need a life jacket?
As reality sinks in, many people overreact, doing things that at best are inappropriate and which at worst can cost lives.
The pilot came on a second time and said the plane was going to ditch. They inflated their life jackets in the back, and you could hear pop, 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 pop. I stood up in my seat and told people not to inflate them. It was not the right thing to do. Once you inflate those things, you're very immobile. It's very hard to move around. And the plane comes in and hits the water. You could feel the plane starting to tumble. And that's it. I said, uh-oh, I'm dead.
Amazingly, 47 people escaped from this alive, thrown clear of the wreckage as the plane broke up.
There was a sailboat, a windsurfer, and a Zodiac. And I said, wow, there's rescue, there's hope.
But many more people had survived the impact, only to die because they were trapped inside the wreckage.
The doctors that were there at the beach, one of them told me that the first 20 bodies he examined had all drowned. They hadn't died of evident primary injuries.
The implication is that many people were trapped by the life jackets that they'd inflated too soon. Their chances of survival reduced by what they'd done immediately before the impact. Once it had happened, the survivors were close enough to a holiday beach for rescue to be on hand immediately, so long-term survival wasn't an issue. But supposing you're miles from anywhere with no hope of rescue, that's when long-term survival comes into play, and that's when you're more likely to be thrown back onto your own resources.
The body has an incredible ability to take care of itself as long as you've got some water and some food, but it becomes a psychological issue in terms of the individual's perception of whether they can make it or not, and that's where the crux is, really.
So to see how that works in practice, I've come to Prince Rupert on the west coast of Canada. About 15,000 people live here, which makes this town a vital hub for lots of smaller communities dotted up and down the coastline of British Columbia and neighbouring Alaska. Often the only way into those villages is by boat or plane, and sometimes they get cut off for weeks or even months at a time. So it's not surprising that the people who live hereabouts are pretty self-reliant. It was in this remote environment that the Wortman family, Father Elmo, son Randy, and daughters Cindy and Gina lived in the late 1970s.
You had to be fairly mentally tough to do the day-to-day things we did, and just to live on the coast and to survive on the coast and travel the coast the way we did.
When she was just 12, Gina Wortman survived an extraordinary ordeal in the wilderness, one in which she relied as much on her mind as upon the skills she learned growing up in these wild and beautiful surroundings. Back in the 1950s, a psychologist called Kurt Richter carried out an experiment that illustrates the kind of beliefs that Gina Wortman, with a brother and sister, needed to survive. He put rats into a cage which had just one opening that led into a long, narrowing tunnel. When the rats tried to get out, some of them just gave up, turned back and stayed there, while others struggled all the way through to the end and freedom. Here you go. But the experiment had two parts. He next put the same rats into a tank of water and found an astonishing difference in the way the two groups behaved. The rats that had given up in the cage gave up again. They just sank to the bottom and drowned, while the ones that had struggled free before kept swimming until they were rescued. What the rats learned is that if you don't give up, you have a very good chance of survival. And that's exactly what the Wortman children had learned from their father. Want it again? Ready? Go! Elmo Wortman died in 1993, but when his children were growing up, he instilled in them such resilience and faith in his leadership that they survived an ordeal which might have led others to give up and die.
Excellent. We were hardy kids, and we were strong and capable and knew how to take care of ourselves. And yet, my dad was the authority.
It was just driven home that on the boat or in a dangerous situation, you listen to Dad and you don't question what he's telling you to do, because it could be the difference between life and death.
Man, let's go. As the Wortman family left Prince Rupert one February afternoon, those beliefs were about to be tested to the limits and beyond. They were sailing to their home in Alaska, 120 miles away, across some of the most exposed and dangerous waters in the area. Their route would take them past the cabin at Rose Inlet, and I'm going to follow it as closely as I can, using Elmo's own account. They were aiming for Cordova Bay here, and from there on up to Craig. The cabin is about here. But when they got to this point, a storm came up. As the winds hit 80 miles an hour, the Wortmans tried to ride them out. They thought they'd be blown out to sea, but they were actually being driven onto the shore.
Dad! Dad, I can see land!
Come on, kids, we've got to get off the boat!
Dad was deciding what was going with us and what wasn't going with us.
Come on, kids, we've got to get going! Grab your phone or coat!
In a sense, like he was completely in control of what was really a very out of control situation.
Get over the side! Peter, we've got to go now! The Wortmans were in deep trouble, shipwrecked on a remote and uninhabited Alaskan shoreline in the middle of winter. No one would know they were missing, and no one would find them by chance. This is where they got out of the water, and of course, in their situation, the thing to do is to stop. That stands for S, stop, don't panic. T, think about your situation. O, orientate yourself. And most importantly, P, plan. And that's exactly what they did.
My dad started taking control of the decision making, and my brother, even at 15 years old, he was a hard worker and very focused. And so we all kind of fit back into our roles and started to look at the situation as a survival situation instead of as a hopeless situation.
They built a basic shelter where they would spend the first night ashore and scavenged for what little food they could find. Their first meal was a handful of mussels cooked on an open fire like that, but you need an awful lot of those if you're going to survive for any length of time. The problem with this beach is that there isn't very much food here. For most of the year, this is exposed to heavy surf, which means there are very few mussels to be found on the rocks. And it has a solid floor, so you can't even dig for clams. Added to that, the wind was simply howling in here, so there wasn't even any shelter. They could have just slumped into apathy, as many people have done in similar situations. But the Wortmans knew that if they were going to live, they had to get away from here. They would have to rely on a leaking dinghy, which would only support 2 people without sinking. It would need strengthening for the 20-mile journey to the hut.
It just seemed very hard to understand how we were going to pull that off, but I've seen Dad pull off amazing things before. So at that point, again, I didn't see it, but I was looking to him to show me the way on exactly how we were going to do it.
Those people who survive report an ability to break their survival down into separate tasks, smaller tasks, and to take it one step at a time. Survival's not a big task. Survival is a whole series of small tasks.
From familiar landmarks, they'd figured out exactly where they were, which is this inlet just here. Now their plan was to head to the nearest people at the hut in Rose Inlet, way up here.
We'll see you in the next bay.
First they had to move to a more sheltered bay to work on the dinghy. Eventually it would have to carry all 4 of them across 2 miles of open water. But for now they split up, Randy and Gina going by sea, Cindy and Elmo making a treacherous hike through dense woodland and snow-filled gullies.
I was like Superwoman at that point. I could have hiked anything. I had to know that they were okay. It was just adrenaline, and I was beyond fear. For my own safety, all I knew was we were gonna get up the beach to where they were.
It was only a mile away, but it took Cindy and Elmo 2 whole days to reach Randy and Gina on the second beach. Back together again, they lashed driftwood to the dinghy to make it buoyant enough to carry them all. But even then, the 2-mile crossing would be touch and go. Once they got to the other side of the straits, they'd follow the coastline along for the 20 miles to the cabin. What they didn't realise is it was going to be 3 weeks before they all got there.
I don't think at any point I really felt like we're going to die out here. It never came up. We talked about what we were going to do when this miserable situation ends. And I think the longer we were out there, the more energy we put into thinking about that.
Optimism is critical. If a person is realistically optimistic that they can get through the situation, almost invariably they will. A discouragement is what changes the potential to survive to the probability that you won't.
Their progress was painfully slow, and with little food to be found, they were getting weaker all the time. Twice they decided against letting Elmo and Randy go on ahead, but after a week, they were tantalizingly close to the cabin. This is Keg Point. From here it's 6 miles to Rose Inlet, just beyond that small island. At this point, Elmo and Randy decided to sprint ahead to the cabin and get help, leaving the 2 girls on the beach. They said they would be back within 3 hours.
Be careful.
It was such a relief because we finally were at that point where help is actually going to come. We're going to be warm, we're going to be dry by noon. And it was just wonderful to think about.
In this boat, it'll take me about an hour to get to the hut. But for Randy and Elmo, it was a whole day slogging against the wind and the waves, paddling all the way. They would also be feeling the effects of 10 days with hardly any food, not to mention the draining effect of the cold and the damp. And remember, they'd told the girls they'd be back within 3 hours.
What if they don't come back? What's taking them so long?
I figured they'd just run into a lot more trouble than they expected, but that eventually they were going to get it together and come back. And maybe that was a certain childhood just confidence in your daddy, but also denial, because I couldn't conceive of losing my dad and my brother.
Randy and Elmo turned into Rose Inlet here to face yet another setback. This whole area was covered in ice, too thick to get the boat through, yet too thin to walk on. They abandoned the dinghy at the edge of the ice and carried on frost-bitten feet, using the last of their strength. It's hard to imagine now how desperate things must have been. This is just 40 feet from the hut, but when Elmo and Randy came here, this was deep in snow. They struggled up the slope, fully expecting to find help and someone to go back to the two girls before nightfall. Things in here look pretty much the same as they would have back then. When they got here, they hoped there would be people because they knew that there were trappers who spent the whole winter out here. But unfortunately, the trap lines had been closed at the end of the season just a few days earlier, and it was deserted. But what they did find was this, an old CB radio. To get it working, they connected it up to a car battery, and at last, they were able to call for rescue.
Mayday, Mayday, this is Rose Inlet calling any station. Come in, please.
But the cabin was in a notorious radio dead spot, and snow had covered the aerial. Their plan had failed, and they were too frostbitten and weak to leave the hut. All they could do was rebuild their strength to the point where they could at least attempt a rescue. Cindy and Gina were left to fend for themselves.
And I've had people say, oh, you must have some real issues with abandonment and things like that. I never once felt abandoned, and after I knew what had happened, I never once felt like they weren't doing everything they could to get back to us. They could barely walk. They knew it was suicide to go back out.
Here you go, Randy.
Thanks. For anyone to say that they were in a better position than Cindy and I were in, I think they're mistaken, because the psychological aspect of it was so much worse for them.
After one particularly cold night, Elmo and Randy became convinced the girls must have died.
They had to deal with death. And Cindy and I were not dealing with death in our minds. We were dealing with life.
Can you imagine chocolate cake when we get back? I know what I'm gonna have. I'm gonna have a big roast beef dinner with mashed potatoes and vegetables.
It was a struggle for food, and it was a struggle to keep warm. But I think the reason the two of us stayed alive all that time was that I had complete faith that they would come back.
We're just gonna have a big feast, okay? Mm-hmm. Dad can pay for everything.
At one point, I had this vivid dream, and my dad and my brother were standing there by this fire, and I said, "What's going on? Where are you? You said you were gonna come back. What is it?" And he just looked at me, he said, "Just take one day at a time, babe."
It wasn't until the morning of the 12th day at the hut that the tide started to turn for them. By then, the snow had melted sufficiently that Elmo could come down here and search amongst the remains of this old cannery. He was amazed to find a fiberglass boat. It needed patching up, but the next day it was ready for the trip back to Keg Point.
If we would have known the first day that my dad left us on the beach that it wasn't going to be a matter of a few hours, but it would be 13 days, I think that would have made a big difference. I don't think I could have convinced myself that we would stay alive that long with next to nothing. But then again, life is life, and as long as you're living, you just keep on living. You do things to live. If you start thinking about death, death is there.
This is where they must have come ashore. You can imagine how they were feeling. They left the girls here 13 days before, and they were convinced they'd both be dead. Elmo made Randy wait down here by the shore while he went ahead to see what he could find.
Gina?
I heard my dad's voice.
Dad? Dad! Oh, thank God!
I was so excited and I was so happy, and I said, "I knew you were going to come back. I knew it. I knew it."
And he said, "You're alive." And again, it was like, well, of course. We couldn't imagine what else we would be. The crew was back together, and there was our leader, and it was wonderful.
They reached the hut to find that the owners had returned while Randy and Elmo had been away. They were rescued soon after by a Coast Guard helicopter. Their survival in a frozen wilderness defied medical science.
We had the Coast Guard, the search and rescue, the doctors coming in and shaking their heads. They said, that just doesn't happen, but it does. And I think we tend to put a lot of focus on what the limits are, instead of thinking, we don't know what the limits are.
Physically, Elmo Wortman came out of the ordeal worst, frostbite claiming half of one foot and all the toes on the other. Despite having lived for a month without food and in freezing conditions, both Cindy and Gina Wortman made full recoveries. But there's more to surviving than just being rescued. Many survivors have to overcome deep-seated psychological trauma long after the original ordeal is over.
For a long time, I carried around guilt, thinking that I really didn't do enough. I didn't try hard enough, I didn't paddle hard enough or long enough. And it's taken 20 years to realize that at 12, you can only do so much. And I realized that I was forgiving so much in so many other people. And then I could look back and see that I hadn't forgiven the 12-year-old that I was. And realizing that that's really a long time to hold a grudge, especially against a 12-year-old. Even now, at the end of my journey, sitting near to the beach where Cindy and Gina spent 13 long days, it's hard to imagine the amount of mental toughness they needed to survive here. I've seen this area at its best with long summer days, where they had the long, cold, bitter nights of winter. And where they faced starvation, I've been able to find plenty of food, like the salmon that I'm cooking in a traditional way. But just because their ordeal occurred in remote wilderness, don't think that these skills don't apply to you. We, all of us, at some point in our lives, find events spiralling out of control. At those times, it's not what you know that counts, but how you apply it. Just as I said at the beginning of the program, you have to make your psychology work for you. Next week, survival at sea.